Well, good morning and welcome everyone to ACT United's 7th Annual Community Awareness to Action Conference Behind the Veil. My name is Seisha. I am the Director of Outreach and Missions for ACT United, and I will be one of your hosts this morning and your Q&A moderator. This year, our conference looks very different. We're virtual, and we've offered throughout the week a different class. And each webinar has addressed a new topic with an expert speaker. This morning is the third and final webinar of our conference series, and our topic is spiritual abuse, how pedophiles groom congregations for sexual abuse. We will hear from 2 speakers and then have 10 minutes for Q&A. Throughout the hour, you can enter your questions in the Q&A chat box below. Now I would like to introduce you to your other host and one of your speakers, Jessica Bartholomew. She is the founder and executive director of ACT United. With 25 years of experience working with children, teens, and at-risk communities in youth outreach, missions work, and as a retired police officer, Jessica brings firsthand information and experience to the issues of child and teen sexual exploitation, abuse, and trafficking. She is the author and lead facilitator of Youth Aware Teen Exploitation Prevention Program, and she also provides community education classes and professional training to equip and engage everyone in creating safe communities for our youth. Jessica is an engaging, passionate speaker to both youth and professional audiences, who will leave you not just informed of the facts of juvenile sex trafficking, but inspired to take action by her message that united we win. With that said, Jessica, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Seisha. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning on this topic. The passion has already been rolling this morning, just as we've been talking about how important this is. So we have a very important topic and a lot of information to get out to you this morning. So I am going to get started and introduce our first speaker, Attorney Reese Frederickson. In 2014, Rhys was elected county attorney in Pine County, Minnesota. Rhys has over 10 years of experience as a prosecutor and has tried many jury trials. Rhys is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Duluth, has a master's degree in business administration from the University of New Mexico, a Juris Doctor from the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, and is a former Air Force officer. In 2016, Rhys was named Attorney of the Year by Minnesota Lawyer magazine. He was also named Outstanding Prosecutor of the Year by Mothers Against Drunk Driving. In 2017, Rhys was named a Policy Fellow at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He has also appeared on ABC's 2020 for his work in bringing an international fugitive and cult leader, Victor Barnard, to justice. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Attorney Frederickson.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to quickly share a screen here. So what I'm going to talk about is a case that is, it was egregious, it was horrific, but it's fascinating and really instructive as to what communities and spiritual leaders and what we can do to keep ourselves and our kids safe. So I thought what I'd do is give you a quick overview of what happened in this case from beginning to end. And normally this would probably take me a couple hours to go through it thoroughly, because there's a lot of material here, but I'll give you just kind of the overview of what happened and the aftermath, and then we'll talk about lessons learned and how we can apply this to our lives and keep each other safe. So I will dive right in. As you'll see on this slide, this is a picture of Victor Barnard that he took of himself at the height of his powers as a cult leader. And you can see that he's in some sort of shepherd's clothing and trying to give that image that he's this leader of his flock, this wise leader, protector. The reality is that Victor Barnard was a con man and a pedophile. I mean, that's all he was, a con man and a pedophile is what it comes down to. And that flock that he was supposedly protecting, he preyed on them, and he especially preyed on the most vulnerable people within that flock. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in the mid-90s, he came up to Pine County and moved his cult up here. At most, they had 150 members and lived on an isolated area of our county. And this is one of the girls that he sexually assaulted when he was a cult leader. He raped her when she was the age of 12, separated her from her family, and the abuse continued for about 9 years. That's Jasana. The other young woman at the center of this case is Lindsay Tornambi. Here's a picture of Victor Barnard embracing Lindsay. He began raping her when she was 13 years old. Abuse went on for about 10 years. And as I said, she was 13. He was about 39 years old at the time. This is Victor Barnard today. This is his mugshot. He's in prison now. He's going to be in prison for quite a while. And it was because of those two girls that came forward after years after they had escaped this situation and reported what happened to law enforcement. Just some photos of the sentencing hearing, and that's Jess and Lindsay on the picture on the right there today. It was a couple of years ago. And it's an interesting story because what he thought were the two most vulnerable people in his cult were the ones that really brought him down. So to give this an overview, I'll start way from the beginning. And how did this start? How did Victor Barnard start out? So Victor Barnard was born in 1961. He's from a privileged upbringing in Minneapolis. He went to the prestigious Breck School, which is where we have a lot of CEOs, a lot of politicians have graduated from there. He was a standout athlete. He went to Hobart College in New York, and he received a full ride scholarship because of his athletic skills. So things were looking pretty good for 18-year-old Victor Barnard as he's going forward in life. He moves out to New York to go to college, and around this time, his home life back in Minneapolis has just imploded. His mother has significant mental health issues. The family's breaking apart. He's away from home for the first time in his life. And like a lot of people in college, he's vulnerable. And what happened was that a despondent Victor Barnard is in his dorm room one day, and somebody walks by, sees him, sees the states that he's in, and says to Victor, "You look like somebody who needs Jesus in your life." And this wasn't a person from a legitimate church who said this. This was actually a recruiter from a cult who stated this to young Victor Barnard. And believe it or not, this still happens today. There are still recruiters out there from cults, especially on college campuses. This happens all the time because, again, people are especially vulnerable when they've left home for the first time. And so Victor Barnard becomes part of this cult, this religious group. It's called the Way International. At its height, the Way International had about 100,000 members. It's a huge cult. It was worldwide, lots of money, giant campus in Ohio. I think there's still some remnants of that campus there. And the cult was all about this Dr. Victor Wherewell. So coincidentally, the cult leader's name was Victor. And Victor Barnard really is an enthusiastic member of this large cult, and so enthusiastic that they've chosen him for basically secondary leadership within this cult. So he goes through kind of a leadership mentorship program. He marries the cult leader's secretary. So he's in a high position in this type of cult. Well, what happens is that about the mid 80s, two things happen that causes this cult to implode. Number one is that coincidentally, there's a large sex scandal because, again, the cults exist to serve the needs of the leader, which is sexually, which is money and power. That's why cults exist. It's all for the leaders, those three things for the leader. And it comes out that the cult leader is having affairs with numerous wives of the members while he's been preaching, chastity and respect for each other and things like that, he's doing things, of course, that are behind their back and not aligned with those teachings. So it starts splintering this cult. The other thing that happens is that the cult leader dies. And of course, the center of the cult is the leader. Once the leader dies, the cult really disintegrates. There's power struggles. Suddenly, this huge group of 100,000 people just kind of evaporates and splinters. And what Victor Barnard did was he left, he and his wife, and they returned to Minnesota. And Victor gets a job up in Minneapolis and buys property on a place called River Road, which is east of Rush City in Chisago County. And he has this, I believe, at least around this time, he has this vision that he's going to restart the cult and make it in his own image. And so he goes out and reaches out to former Way International families, and he recruits a couple of families to come join him in Minnesota. They move to Minnesota. They buy property around Victor Barnard. They build houses next to each other, and slowly they build what they call the River Road Fellowship, a quote unquote church. And Victor Barnard emerges as the leader of this church. And it's about a 10-year process, but they have weekend worships, and it's like anything else. It starts out innocently enough. It's Sundays, but suddenly it expands to its full weekends, and then weekdays are incorporated, and then there's dress codes, there's rules, and the children in the families are pulled out of school and then homeschooled according to the desires of the church. And so over this 10-year process, you see that the church membership is growing with former Way International cult members, and the control is also growing and becoming stricter as Victor Barnard has control over this group. So about 1996, he takes another step in this process, and it's the classic cult move where you want to further separate your group, your membership from society. And so what they do is they buy a former resort restaurant up in rural township in Finlayson, which is in Pine County. It's just the county of my jurisdiction. A beautiful piece of property, lots of cabins, large buildings, a lot of lakeshore. They purchase it for $575,000, and they all move from River Road Fellowship onto this property. And when they get to this property, what they do is they establish businesses. They have a butcher shop, a construction company, a dairy, cabinet shop. So numerous ways to hopefully, they thought, to sustain themselves, to make money. And of course, then they established, they have like a mess hall, they built a church, and they start modifying the cabins into homes. So it becomes this large insulated compound. Again, classic cult leader move. If you think about, of course, Jonestown, Branch Davidians, same type of thing. Now, outwardly, what they wanted to project was this was a legitimate church because rumors are getting around and people are asking questions. This is from a brochure that I had found in our land records, and it shows Victor Barnard on left side there under the ministers, Victor and his wife. Below him are the youth leaders, the Fronsacs. Top right is David and Tina Larson. David Larson plays a bit in the downfall of Victor Barnard later on too. Bottom corner there, we have Randy and Pam Rourke. Pam Rourke was Victor Barnard's personal secretary. She was involved in procuring some of what happened later on also. And then Craig and Susan Elmblad. Craig Elmblad was what they considered the enforcer in the cult. So a lot of times we look at cults, they always have a person or a group who acts kind of as the muscle and enforcer, and that was really Craig Elmblad's job. And they call themselves the Shepherd's Camp, owned and operated by River Road Fellowship. So again, this was kind of their outward appearances, trying to be a legitimate church. The ordination certificate of Victor Barnard. Of course, he's self-ordained, which is a common characteristic of cult leaders. It's signed by the trustees. And just some pictures of life on the property. So here are some of the cult members' homes. This particular building, this barn-like structure, this was where Victor Barnard, he lived on one floor and had an office on the other floor. The other significance of this structure is that it was next to the only entrance to this compound. So while of course all the other men are working at their butcher shops or the businesses that they have. They're working 14 to 16-hour days. Victor spends his days with the females of the cult and in this office. So what happens, there's always curiosity seekers. If they drive in, he'll run out and stop cars, turn them around and tell them to get lost. This resort place is actually on the end of a lawn dirt road, so it's fairly remote. Again, he's trying to keep them secluded from society. Living at this site, there were a number of rules, including they couldn't venture more than 30 minutes from the compound. Obviously, it's a control issue. His justification was that if Christ came back, they needed to be within 30 minutes of it. So for that event, so that was what he always had, a biblical justification for all his rules. Dress codes, I'll talk about that a little bit. The other interesting thing here is too, I mentioned earlier that Victor Barnard was married. He had 4 sons. He, about a year or so after living on this compound, he gave a sermon in front of the church where he removed his wedding ring, put it in a bowl, said that he was essentially divorcing his wife. And the reason was that because he was married to the church. Again, I think this is one of those long-term steps. He was looking ahead to at least justify what he was going to do next with some of the female members of the cult, just to normalize that. So he spent time at this place and he wrote books. They established their own publishing company and had a website where they circulate a lot of his teachings and publications. Now in 2000, after about 3 or 4 years of living on this compound, Victor Barnard takes his next step in this kind of long-term process. Again, he's a pedophile and he's a con man, and he's a very patient one. So in 2000, he gives a sermon in front of the church and says that God spoke to him. He's described himself as either an apostle or Jesus Christ in the flesh, but he tells the church, God spoke to me. And what God told me was that the firstborn daughters of the families of their membership belong to him. They belong to him in service of Christ. And because he's Christ in the flesh, they serve him. And so what he did was he called out a list of 10 names, girls ranging in the ages of 12 to, I believe, 19, 17, 19, in that area, and said that they will move out of their parents' homes and they will come and live near him to serve him. And it's a place of honor. They're considered nuns. They'll remain chaste. They'll learn directly from him, and they'll serve the Lord. And of course, your family should be honored that your daughter was chosen for this group. And so what he did was that he called out these names, and then they had a group of 10 girls, and he moved them into this fourplex. It's a picture of the actual fourplex on the property. And this fourplex is actually removed from the rest of the compound. So again, he's further isolated. And at the time, he had a large RV that, if you can see kind of by the propane tank there, there's some gravel. That's where the RV was parked. And so he lived in the RV, and then the girls had a schedule that was set up by Victor's secretary, Pam Rourke. And that schedule dictated where these girls were to be that day and what they were to do. And it involved complete service to Victor Barnard. So for instance, there'd be 2 girls assigned to a shower. And if Victor Barnard took a shower, they'd wait outside the shower. They'd give him towels or whatever he needed, take care of his grooming, take care of his manicuring, things like that. There would be another girl or 2 assigned to making his breakfast, putting snacks out for him, getting his clothes out. They'd actually make his clothes as well. So complete life is devoted to service to him. And yeah, it's surreal that this happened, but it did, and he and that's what the girls would spend their entire days doing. And then they'd do music lessons together, have services with him and things like that. So here's an actual picture of when the girls were moving into that fourplex. And of course, interesting thing that then later on was changed was that, or I don't think the intent was to change it, but he stated to these families that this was going to be a temporary situation. I know in his mind that it was going to be, he wanted it to be long-term, but to kind of sell the families on this, he said it was going to be temporary, and the girls would learn and eventually they'd return. That's not what happened. And so they moved into this fourplex, and that's Jess in the foreground there. She looks always scared. And then these are a number of pictures that we obtained when we were prosecuting this case. But here we have a picture of Jess and Lindsay, and again in the foreground here with Victor. And if you see their hair and their clothing, these are all part of their dress codes. Their hair has to be worn a certain way. They were not allowed to look other men in the eye or spend any time alone with other men, and they only could walk around 2 by 2. So if they went to a dentist's office or something, there was always 2 girls that went along. Picture of Victor Barnard with this group is called the Maidens. He called them the Maidens. And here they are playing and singing. Stomping grapes. A picture of Victor Barnard's foot. I thought that was interesting that this litigation, we had a bunch of pictures, but they revered this guy so much that even they thought his foot was holy, and they had pictures of his foot smashing grapes as if that signified something. Victor, and there's Lindsay in the background playing music. More pictures of life on the compound. As I mentioned earlier, they could only go 30 minutes away from the compound. The only exception was that Victor Barnard declared that Gooseberry Falls was a holy land or holy area, so he brought the girls up there frequently, and this is a picture of them playing music in the woods. That was the only exception for leaving the compound more than 30 minutes away. Now, as I said, they declared that this would be a temporary situation, but I know in his mind they wanted to make it permanent. It was going to be a permanent, and so he took that next step in about 2001. So in 2001, after the girls had been living there about a year, separated from their families, he went around to each set of parents, and he took Craig Elmblad with him. Craig, again, that's the enforcer in the cult, and went to the parents and said, "I'd like your permission to marry your daughter. And it would be a spiritual marriage. And I'm going to just warn you that in the future, I may have sexual intercourse with your child, and just seeking your blessing." And of course, the parents are intimidated. They're blindly devoted to this guy, and they give him their blessing, essentially. So what Victor Barnard didn't tell the parents was that he had already been having sex with at least Jess and Lindsay. And he that started within a month of when they moved onto this compound. Jess was 12 years old when he forced himself on her. And these girls were forced to have sex with him through physical abuse, coercion, intimidation, shame, and if they didn't comply, they weren't serving the Lord. You name it, he used everything against them to accomplish this. And it was the same thing with Lindsay, and that started when she was 13 years old. But he went to the parents and acted like he wasn't doing that, and then said, well, maybe in the future when they're older, I will. And then he told the parents that their daughters would remain virgins because he's Christ in the flesh, and if he has sex with a girl, they're still going to remain a virgin because he's the lamb. And they had a popular saying in the cult was that the blood of the lamb covers all. And so what happened, and this is a picture of that night, is that he had the 10 maidens, the 10 girls, going to the church, and they had actually a wedding ceremony with 10 brides, and he gave each of them a ring, and they called it a salt covenant after a ceremony in the Bible, but each female took a dab of salt on her tongue to signify their spiritual marriage to Victor Barnard. So this quote unquote temporary situation, this is what he did to make it more permanent. Here's a picture of Victor with the Maidens. Jess is, you see here in the foreground. Lindsay's in the back, top corner, right. There's a dark haired girl next to Lindsay. That's Christina. She's a foreign exchange student. I believe she was at UMD, and she got roped into this group. She's from Brazil, wealthy family in Brazil. She plays a part later on. So obviously the good times don't always last forever, kind of like the way international things start to implode. And what happened in 2004 is that the cult sells the compound. And if you remember, they bought it for $575,000. They were able to flip the whole property for $3 million. So now this cult is wealthy. They have millions of dollars. And he takes that money and he buys more property in Pine County and essentially buys property in 3 areas, hoping to create multiple compounds. And he's got his own home in each compound. Each compound's got a business. Families live nearby, and it's blocked off from society. And each of these areas also has a church. And so they're building nice houses for him at these sites. This is one of his houses. The rest of the members are living in trailers and are working 14, 16 hours a day to keep the finances afloat and things like that. If he spends all this money on this property, he lives like a rock star. He has a Cadillac Escalade and a Harley Davidson and a chrome plated RV, drives among these compounds with greeted by, the females. And he's also sexually abusing wives of cult members as well. Now, his first group of maidens, that process, again, that was kind of normalized within the cult. And about 2004, he puts together another group of maidens through a sermon. And so he's got 2 groups of girls that for sure we know he was abusing Jess and Lindsay. The others haven't come forward yet, but we know what was happening with that one as well. And with these girls, he moves them they build a duplex, and the girls occupy one side of the duplex, and he has his own access and door to these girls. This lasts for a couple of years until about 2009, when one of the cult members is having issues with Victor Barnard. And what the straw that breaks the camel's back is, of course, he discovers that Victor has been having an affair with his wife. And this cult member comes forward and says, look, you've been preaching virtue and chastity and being faithful, and you're not practicing those same things. And I'm going to go to law enforcement and report what you're doing to members of this church, unless you give a sermon confessing everything that you've done. And so Victor Barnard gives a sermon and admits to the congregation that he's been having regular sex with a number of the wives of the members. And I don't know if his thought was that they were going to forgive him and move on, but that's not quite what happens. Things start to splinter. There's a big group that's still loyal to him, but people start leaving the cult. And about this time as well, the businesses are failing. They're running through their money. There's foreclosures. So everything's kind of coming to a head. About a year later, a mandated reporter finds out about the sexual abuse with the wives and the members there. And it's reported, reported law enforcement, investigated. A county attorney, my predecessor, chose not to charge that case. So that went by for another year. And around this time, Victor Barnard and the others have left. There's some still in the area, but Barnard moves out to Washington County with his most loyal supporters. Some of them are the former Maidens. And then about 2012, after Jess and Lindsay have escaped from the situation, they went to law enforcement and described, obviously in detail, what happened to them over the years. And what that led to was a really large investigation. It took almost 2 years of digging into this cult. Around 2014, Victor Barnard is charged with 59 felony counts of criminal sexual conduct for the years of abuse against Jess and Lindsay. Again, when they're young girls and teenagers, and lasting into when basically they're women. Of course, around this time, Victor Barnard is fled. Nobody knows where he is. Intelligence puts him in Canada, Washington State, or Brazil. And he's featured on lots of news media, Nancy Grace, local media. There's an episode of The Hunt with John Walsh dedicated to him. Finally, after some intelligence work and surveillance of Christina, who is that foreign exchange member student of the cult, she's back in Brazil. They figure that Barnard's probably with her because her family's got a lot of money. They find him living a pretty good life in a condo in a seaside community in kind of northern Brazil area. And so local Brazilian police bust his door down and take him into custody. And that was on February 27th of 2015. And he's brought to a Brazilian prison where he languishes for about 16 months while he fights extradition and eventually gives in. And so 16 months later, we have him booked into our jail. That's a picture of him not looking that great after those months in Brazil. And eventually the case is litigated and he actually pleads guilty to what was the maximum of 30 years. So for abuse against Lindsay. And of course, here's some pictures from that and Justin Lindsay at the time. So the case had a good conclusion. I suspect that he gave in because he was a coward and didn't want to face these two girls and really didn't want to put a spotlight on the other things that he was doing in this cult. So with that background, I'll just give you a couple minutes of what we learned from this and why, you know, even this case that's got these the facts are just kind of so out there, how would they be helpful in our communities and protecting us? So like a lot of people during my lifetime, I was a toddler when Jonestown happened, but I remember these images and you think Jonestown, Branch Davidians, Heaven's Gate, you know, the stigma is who's stupid enough to join a cult and become part of this. Even some crass jokes about, you know, maybe these people deserved it for following somebody like this. The truth is that no one joins a cult. That's always a myth that people join a cult. They don't. That doesn't happen. It's something that I learned in litigating these cases. And I've known a number of former cult members, and they're all intelligent, normal, good people, people that you would not be able to pick out in a crowd or suspect that they were part of this. What really happens is that this is a period of indoctrination, and it can happen to almost anyone. And one of my favorite analogies of this, they call it the, you know, it's the carrot and stick approach. We've all heard that. That cult leaders, again, are common, and they zero in on what you are seeking, what you need in your life, and then they promise to provide that if you follow them. And they dangle that in front of the recruits and kind of keep it out there as they continue to reach for it. They provide more incentives to continue to follow. And eventually, that stick is used to beat them into submission. So it's a carrot and stick approach. And eventually you start getting beaten with that stick. That's the best way I've heard that described. And that's the general overview of this. To give it another analogy that I think is great for this and applies to a lot of situations is the boiling frog theory. You've probably heard this, but if you place a frog in a pot of boiling water on a stove, that frog's going to jump out because it recognizes it's boiling water. I'm out of here. But if you place that frog in a pot on the stove in a comfortable temperature water, the frog will stay there. And eventually you slowly crank up that heat and the frog becomes acclimated until the water starts boiling and the frog dies because it's in boiling water before it realizes it. That's exactly how cults work. That's exactly how these pedophiles work. If you look back at the history of the cult, 86, that all started with those Sunday worships. And it just kind of slowly grew. The heat was slowly applied and grew to days, week. And then we have rules, we have homeschooling, we have dress codes, increased restrictions. And then, well, if you're really a follower, you're going to be isolated up in Finlayson and Pine County. And again, we're going to have a temporary situation with this Maidens group to serve the Lord. And then that temporary situation becomes normalized. And then we're marrying these girls. And now we're having another group of girls. And slowly, these cult leaders are getting boiled, or not cult leaders, but the cult members are getting boiled in water, and they don't know what's happening to them. Happens over and over again. And I've seen that happen with other religious contexts. I've had a number of cases in my career too involving church leaders. And it's the same thing. I've seen it a lot, even with, I've had more than my share of youth group leaders that have been convicted of sex crimes. And what I've seen in those cases, it's always a male. And sorry, I don't mean to, you know, specifically call it a gender, but it often is a male in their early 20s. And suddenly they're, you know, their new youth group leader, and they have access to all these kids and especially young teenage girls. And they're always very charming, very personable. They volunteer and everything. and they gain the parents' trust. The parents completely trust them and just find them charming. Maybe they're just a little too friendly, but they got to be in service of the Lord, so they overlook that, right? And so what they do, the same thing like call leaders do, they find a need. If it's a young girl, is it the male attention? They have those are the awkward teenage years. Here's a 20-something-year-old male giving them attention. Is it gifts? Are they from a poor household? They have relationship troubles, school troubles. How can they insert themselves? And then suddenly they have, evening classes with the youth group, and then all of a sudden it becomes these day-long events. And it's a process too of lowering inhibitions. There's maybe more touching, hugging, things like that, closeness, and sometimes they'll even show maybe a little pornography just to see how they react. And then suddenly these day-long events turn into full weekends where they sleep over at the homes of the youth group leaders. The kids are isolated, make them feel special with extra attention. That's when the sexual abuse happens. I've seen it over and over again, and sometimes even in the same church with recurring youth leaders. So I was always interested that 90% of the sexual abuse has occurred from people we know in our families, people that we know are acquainted with. As a society, we're all of us know about stranger danger. When I was a kid, the big case was Jacob Wetterling. He was about my age, and it was shocking, egregious, and really woke a lot of people up. But in some respects, though, you don't think about the person in your life that that's maybe just a little too ingratiating, wants to spend a little too much time with your kids. That's the person that we have to pay attention to, especially in your communities and congregations. So I am out of time. I'm Dr. Lalich. It's a cult expert. If you ever want to know more about cults, check out her books. Wonderful person. She acted as an expert in my case. She can give you more background in some of these why cults come into formation. So I'm going to end it there and say thank you. This is a picture of Lindsay and Jess at the sentencing. A really sad postscript to this is that Jess, and that's the tattooed arm on the right, Jess committed suicide about a year ago, and a lot of it was due to her trauma as a child. So we miss her greatly. She was just an absolutely wonderful person, wonderful spirit. But this is why it's important that we have to root out this evil, because people like this don't deserve to be out of our lives and deserve to be here with us. So I'll give it back. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Rhys, for that session. I'll ask you to stand by for our Q&A at the end of the hour. And, just a reminder, put your questions into the Q&A box. There's a chat box, and then you should also have a Q&A box. If you enter your questions into the Q&A box, Seisha is keeping track of those and will be moderating. And the more questions we get in advance, the more we will be able to organize those and get to as many as possible at the end of our hour. And this is a difficult topic. It is extremely important if we have the desire to create safe communities for children and teens and families. If we have a heart and a passion to make sure they're protected against sexual abuse and exploitation and trafficking, this is one of those topics that we can't put to the side or ignore or not do the hard work to discuss and take a look at. But having said that, we also need to take care of ourselves in this work. As we are learning, we also need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves as we process this information. And if anybody needs any help or advocacy with a particular situation, or you need somebody to hear your story, or you have something that you want a professional opinion on, please reach out to us at ACT United. I know that our team has been doing a really good job of getting our contact info pushed out into the chat throughout the webinar this morning. So please reach out if you need resources, help, or referrals, or somebody just to listen. Please do that. So I am going to share a screen here, and I am going to take our next few minutes to help us translate or turn, what do we do next, right? How do we turn what we know now, awareness and information, into some small, concrete action steps that we can take today? And, you know, on this subject, as I go to share my screen here, there we go. Hopefully everybody can see this pulling up now. But as I share, get ready to get rolling here, you know, I wrote a blog for an article for our blog about 4 or 5 years ago, when all the child sex abuse cases started coming out in the Catholic Church, and all the sex abuse cases started coming out with the Boy Scouts of America. I wrote an article because I really saw two very extreme camps or ways of thinking kind of emerge out of this information. And one was the, you know, all of the Boy Scouts and all of the Catholic Church and everybody in those systems are bad and are pedophiles. And there was like this march against everyone as a whole. And then on the other side, it was a rather extreme opinion as well, where people were actually defending not just the church or a particular organization, but even defending those individuals. And so we had the defense camp, and then we had the condemn everybody that's ever been involved in any way possible camp. So I wrote this article because somewhere in all of that, we need to find the facts and the reality and the truth. And that is that child predators, whether that's going to take the form of a cult leader or an individual predator preying on just particular individuals, either way, no profession, no group, no church, nothing in life is exempt of the possibility of this happening. So we have to be aware of what are those signs and indicators and those things that we can look for in a person who has the potential or may show the red flags of child predator behavior, so that we can, because both those extremes are not going to do any service to protecting kids and teens. So that's what I'm going to do and want to get into for the next few minutes, is summarizing some of those congregational grooming tactics, those individual child predator signs and indicators we need to look for, and then 5 steps that we can take, you, I, anybody can take today to help create safe faith communities for children and teens. So what I don't want to have happen is for us to miss something very important that Attorney Frederickson said, which is nobody signs up to join a cult. This happened over a 10-year period or process of behaviors and grooming and tactics that led to this level of control and isolation and abuse. So we cannot afford to disconnect ourselves thinking this only happened, that this is blatantly obvious and it would stick out like a sore thumb if it ever presented ourselves, because very good and grounded people can be subject to this type of manipulation. And those of us that have worked with people in these situations know that to be very true. So I just want to highlight very briefly 3 different cases here in our Twin Cities metro area and then a neighboring state. This case right here, 4 men charged after a prostitution bust, which is a gross understatement of this case because I was one of the lead investigators in this case back when I was in police work. This was CBS WCCO News in 2012. And what this case actually was juvenile sex trafficking. And the trafficker in this case was a 55-year-old man that was picking up runaways, giving them drugs, sexually assaulting them, and then hosting parties at his single-family home in a residential neighborhood where he would invite his business associates to the home and was selling these young people for sexual acts with his business partners. How was he described by his friends and his church members, where he went to a very large Twin Cities church? A family man, an active church member, a volunteer at the men's ministry events. And when a 15-year-old girl in the congregation finally told her mother that this man had attempted to sexually assault her and sell her for sex acts to his business partners, the mom, the mother, and the daughter did the right things, did all the right steps. And when they went to meet with the lead pastor of the church in his office and told him what happened and how they wanted other members of the church to be safe, what they were told by the head pastor is, you are women that are very dangerous and gossiping against a man to ruin a man's reputation who is a good man and an upstanding man in this church. So they were called gossipers and horrible women for bringing such allegations. And of course, we would find him 3 years later after trafficking dozens of other teenagers. Right now, as we speak, there's a former lead pastor and his wife, both who are being arraigned in a Michigan court for their involvement in sex trafficking teenage boys. And I wanted to highlight this case only because not all traffickers are men, some are women, and not all victims are girls, some are boys. And this pastor used his position as the senior pastor, and she used her position as an employee of the local high school to find and pay teenage boys to do sex acts with her, with the wife, as well as other adults. And this case right here is incredibly disturbing. And so I've actually taken out some of the bullet points just for this morning. But this Reverend Foucher is charged with 21 counts of felony sexual exploitation of a child. And when child pornography was found to lead back to a computer at the church with the login name of this particular reverend is how the case began. And search warrants into his personal computer and his cell phone found 2,000 photos and videos depicting child sexual abuse pornography, chat room conversations he was having about his desire to rape and kill children, and an online conversation describing his attraction to 6-year-old boys, and that the thought, and this is a quote from his chat, the thought of killing someone does begin to excite me. And all this is happening while he is serving in his local church. For 45 years, he served in his local church. How was he described by local law enforcement on the case? The files found were described by police as violent, disturbing, and torturous. And the lead investigator, who does this for a living, he was with the International Crimes Against, not international, for his state, Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. Every state has one. So he does this for a living, and even having exposure to multiple cases, said the volume of images was something I haven't come across, and the extreme nature of the images took a toll on both myself and others involved in the investigation. So how was Reverend Foucher described? Well, his defense attorney said he's not just a good person, he's a wonderful person who has helped hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So of course, it's the defense attorney's job to do that, to divert attention off of this horrifying criminal behavior, to refocus on all the meals he served and all the homeless shelters and all the people he counseled and all the confessions he heard, to divert attention onto that behavior. We expect that out of the defense, okay? However, what also the defense presented at sentencing was a letter from the mayor, just a citizen, a community leader from the community, presented a letter of support that he read from Boise Mayor Dave Beater, who said, "Foucher has helped my family." So let's summarize a couple of things. And I think our last session did an absolute fantastic service to us, bringing these points across. This is, just direct experience that I've had in different cases and my involvement with helping churches, congregations, people, youth navigate their way out of these particular situations. These are some of the common things that we've seen. And the first thing is their goal is to gain the support and trust of the whole group. That's why we have congregational and family grooming, even though the target is really at the children. But the way they gain access to children is you first have to gain the trust and the support and the compliance of the adults, the parents, and the church leaders. They're often described in here, charming. I'm out of fingers and toes counting how many of these personality types, and we heard it in our last session, are described as charming, fun, friendly, good volunteers, helpful. They've even been described as being a fatherly or motherly figure in the congregation or in the church or to young people. In religious, Christian, and spiritual communities, they use and manipulate your very scriptures or doctrines. Your belief systems are manipulated to gain that control, obedience, compliance, and secrecy. Things like the scriptures or doctrines on authority or spiritual authority, scriptures on submitting to authority, being manipulated and presented in such a way to gain control and compliance to the leader, to the person that is in charge. Scriptures on the difference between obedience versus the sin of rebellion. That's often brought up, rebellion or gossip, because if I can make you feel at sin, that you're somehow in sin or against God or some God or Almighty, right? You're not just me. This isn't against me. That you're not just talking to somebody else about your concerns about me. You're in sin. To gain more of that secrecy, make it feel like it's more your fault and your sin that you would even discuss what's going on with other people, calling it gossip. The other thing that I've seen consistently is creating this inside us versus the outside them. There's the we or the us. We are family, we are community, we are loving, we have a community of love and respect versus them in the outside world, the worldly people and systems, even calling people or people outside of the congregation evil. They are different, they don't understand and they won't get it. And really the setup of this us in our community versus the them of the world is helpful with the isolation and the obedience, but it's also a manipulative setup for when the outside people, your friends and your family members, people that you've trusted your whole life or that are a part of your family, are suddenly saying things like, I've got some concerns, or they start noticing some unhealthy behaviors, or that you are getting isolated and they're noticing things and they give you feedback and they're concerned. This us versus them, they don't get it mentality sets the member up for really dismissing or blocking that kind of input and feedback from others around us. On an individual level, so this is the last thing I'm going to bring up here, and then the 5 steps, and then we'll move into quick Q&A. So I'll try to go as quickly as possible here. But the signs at the individual level of this child predator behavior that we see is oftentimes they appear more comfortable or enjoy being in the company of children and teens more than they do adults or their peers, people their age. They create dependency and intimacy with the child or teen by being very attentive to those child's needs, being a good listener, giving gifts, money, praise. They have special bonds or special relationships with particular children or teenagers, often have nicknames or special names that they use for different kids or teens. They encourage or even promote secrecy, especially from parents or other adults or the outside world. They have an abnormal amount of physical contact with children. Now, depending on the context, you might see the wrestling or the tickling, but it can also be some of those subtleties that seem harmless at first that are really pushing those physical sexual boundaries with kids, seeming innocently at first, touching of the back or the side hugs, you know, touching the hand, the face, or a pat on the leg, that is really pushing and testing those physical and sexual boundaries that are leading to hugs, longer hugs, even kissing of kids, and then of course a very a slope that can get into some very dangerous behaviors. They might even be jealous, controlling, or overly interested in the friendships and the romantic relationships of the teenagers. Overly involved, overly interested in the relationships and romantic interests of the teenagers in their congregations. Removing titles of authority, because if you're an authority figure and you're a child, right, there's this gap, there's this you know, authority figure, and then there's the child, and the way I try to get more on your level, seem more like a peer, is erase that level of authority to a certain degree with kids, and removing any titles of authority like sir, ma'am, or pastor. Just call me by my first name or some sort of nickname. Offering to help parents, single parents, with chores related to the kids, volunteering for things that involve children or teens, the grooming behaviors that we talked about with parents. And one of the most common things that I have seen and that colleagues and partners in this work have seen is part of grooming the parents is also making them feel special, because when the parents feel special, I'm gaining access to the family and access to the children. And the way they make parents feel special is with praise, promotion, titles, positions of authority, or leadership opportunities within the church or congregation. And they may, not all the time, but they may kind of bring up in conversation, discussing that they have been accused in the past or questioned in the past for some of their behaviors, or some of the inappropriate behavior they have had with other people in the past. So, very important topic, very difficult topic, but so needed if we are going to help work together to create safe faith communities and safe communities for children and teens. So what are 5 ways that I want to leave with you this morning before we move into our Q&A? Number 1, trust your gut feelings and initial concerns. Time and time again, people, I've heard this is so many times. Yeah, I did kind of notice he's extra touchy or extra feely, or yeah, I was a little worried at first that he wanted to spend private time or alone time with my son or with my daughter. Yeah, at first, but then, right? But then I realized, and I've heard these people described by kids as, yeah, he's just overly affectionate. He's just affectionate. He's just loving, right? So that slow normalization and desensitization to their behaviors. So trust your gut instincts and stick with that. Number 2, introduce and schedule an awareness or safety program for your faith community. We have training for staff and volunteers. We have congregational messages that are both informational and inspirational. And our Youth Aware program is a very dynamic program. We've been in dozens of churches and high schools and middle schools, just helping kids be aware, but also really helping elevate their voice to their peers and their leadership opportunities for keeping themselves safe, but also being a really good friend and advocate to their peers. And if you want to learn more about any of those programs, go to our website. Number 3, Have policies and practices that protect children. And remember, if you have practices in your faith community protecting kids, that's also a way to protect your staff and your volunteers. When you know what the best practices are and you're following those practices, it's really a protection for everyone in the church or in the community. Number 4, time and talks with your kids. Nothing is ever going to replace quality time and open, honest, non-judgmental, educational conversations with our own kids about online safety, relationship safety, personal boundaries, and make sure we're doing it just in the context of how much we love them and care about them and care about their safety. And lastly, number 5, please consider a donation or becoming a monthly partner with us at ACT United as we continue to do outreach, prevention, and intervention programs for youth, as well as provide different community education programs like this one. And we don't want cost to ever be a barrier to anybody getting this kind of information. So I will stop sharing and I will turn it over to Seisha and get everybody back on board. And I know we're a little bit over time, and us speakers on this topic are so passionate and want kids to be protected that it's really hard to stay in that 20 minutes on something this important. So thank you for sticking with us, and I'll turn it over to Seisha with that.
Thank you, Jessica. So the first question is for Attorney Frederickson. What should you do if you suspect a leader is inappropriate? How would you go about reporting it?
Good question. So I would report it right to law enforcement. Talk to your local sheriff's office or local police. Even if there might be some mandated reporting requirements inside a church as well. So you want to adhere to that. Otherwise, you're going to face legal liability, even though that should be the least of your concerns. It's really protecting the kids. So please report to somebody, talk to others, talk to the leaders in the church.
Thank you. Jessica, what do you recommend for church leaders to make sure that youth leaders or others are not able to groom and abuse?
Yeah, it really is the responsibility, and it should be a welcomed responsibility, right? To take a look at what are the practices, what are the protocols, what are the guidelines within your church policies governing the children's ministry, volunteers, and youth leadership. Some of those things are, what are your vetting procedures for volunteers? Oftentimes in our faith communities, we are so desperate for volunteers, right? That as soon as somebody's willing to help, we don't pause and we don't take that minute to really put them through the same practices or the same protocol to become a volunteer. There should be a background check. You should ask for a couple of references of places they've worked in the past or how they've helped at other organizations in the past. And then once you do have volunteers and you do have people working in children's ministry or youth ministry and have contact with any vulnerable population in your congregation, what's the setup in the church ministry? Do you allow just one adult to be in the room with 10 kids? You know, there should be 2 adults. You should have 2 sets of eyes and ears. And one of the things that I've talked about, just because I have the unfortunate advantage of having cases as, you know, from law enforcement, I recommend not doing the husband and wife team. Only because sometimes with pedophilia and with these criminals, we see that the wife or the husband, it's a joint effort. One's the enabler and one's the abuser. They often work together. So having 2 people in the room at a time. Just taking a look at that, learn what your best practices are, do a training for your staff. Bring in a professional. We have programs. There's others with programs that you could bring in to really take a look at what your protocols are and then help you put together the best policies. It's going to protect you in the long run for several reasons: protect kids, protect staff and volunteers, And it's also going to protect you from some pretty serious liability.
Could I add to that vetting procedure as well? I just say, look at social media. We had a case, this was a school case, but they hired a 30-year-old teacher who had a 19-year-old wife. And if you just looked at briefly at social media, we discovered that the wife was a former student of his. That should have been a red flag. We had recently too, a church case where, yeah, there was some inappropriate contact with an adult female in the church. It took one phone call to his prior church, and they said that he was let go from that church because of inappropriate behavior. Anybody could have made that phone call before hiring that person.
Absolutely.
This one's for Attorney Frederickson. In regards to cult recruitment on college campuses, how often do you see or know of it happening here in Minnesota?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know if there's a way we can actually quantify that. It's more, we hear stories about that happening. It happens all over the nation. That Dr. Lalich that I spoke of earlier, she's a former college professor, and I think she's got a blog, but if you look at her books and such, she discusses that, but it's still pervasive. It's just not as obvious because they present themselves as a legitimate religious organization. So I don't know if I have a good answer to that question. It's hard to quantify.
Thank you. This one is for Jessica. When does the inappropriate become illegal? So maybe elaborating or repeating those inappropriate behaviors.
Well, we have legal definitions for sexual abuse, and we have legal definitions for sexual assault. But one of the factors that starts running that fine line where we're like, oh, should we report or should we not? There should never be any sexual contact with a child or a person of any age, period. The signs and those gut instincts that we need to pay attention to and not ignore. For example, fear also meets a legal standard. When it comes to some relationships under our domestic abuse statutes, before you're assaulted, there is the fear of being assaulted. There is the fear that is produced by a perpetrator. And that actually meets a legal standard. So I guess what I don't want to do is give such a tight legal statute definition that we start to ignore, well, he didn't do this, right? If it feels wrong, if it feels inappropriate, if it feels uncomfortable, that's the flags that begins the ball rolling on taking a deeper look and going a step further and making sure that kids are being protected. And, maybe there's a legal standard, Rhys, you want to add to that, but we do have criminal definitions, but we want to make sure that we don't start tossing out inappropriate or sexual behaviors because we didn't feel it perfectly fit into a legal definition.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to add to that, absolutely, that's well stated. I mean, there's what's legal, illegal, and then there's what you consider inappropriate, and make sure that's defined up front, and people are vetted accordingly and trained accordingly with that. The biggest thing that we see in the religious community with, at least for legal definitions, there's a law that states that even if with adults, if the sexual abuse happens within the confines of, say, they call it religious counseling or something like that, that's against the law. So it's actually expanded when it comes to legal communities, or I'm not legal communities, I mean religious communities.
Thank you. This question came up twice. Is it common for cult leaders to have children with the women they're abusing? And I guess to the case of Victor Barnard?
Absolutely common. And specifically with Victor Barnard, and I see that there's a question about, there's a baby in one of the pictures. he didn't, to what we know of, he didn't have any children with any of the Maidens, and probably maybe too much information, but he about the time he formed the Maidens, he went to Duluth and obtained a vasectomy. So I think they probably go hand in hand with what he was planning to do. But I have to wonder if prior to that, when he was having affairs with the wives of the cult members, if some of their kids were actually victors and not from the husband. But that's extremely common. If you study cults, cult leaders have multiple children. A lot of the children that died in the Branch Davidian compound were children of David Koresh. So many examples of that. Jonestown, I think there were a lot of children too of Jim Jones. Want to explore that case? That's fascinating too.
Thank
I
you.
wanted to speak to one more legal standard that just popped into my mind, because the context that we're in this morning is a little different. However, the overlap of our kids' cell phones and inappropriate photos and videos. And there's legal standard, there's criminal standard there as well. And a lot of times some of these physical relationships begin to develop as an online or a cell phone communication relationship with the leader or the pastor or whoever the person in question is. And any inappropriate photos or videos, anything sexually explicit, doesn't even have to be full nudity, but it can be a sex act or an enactment of something sexual or explicit. Anybody that makes, shares, sends, keeps, or distributes to another person a sexually explicit photo or video of a person under the age of 18, that is actually felony child pornography, and we have laws protecting youth. There's youth that participate in that as a perpetrator as well, so that they'll be held to that same legal standard. But we really put the context on the adults, and so being aware of what their phone and online activity is also very important, and having policies around youth leaders disseminating information about an upcoming event on the cell phone versus this personal communication with a teenager or a child at church. So we want to be just aware of that too.
That's a good point. Can find a way to maybe control some of the images that are created within the church. I had a case too where we had a pastor who was taking images of kids in his church and then photoshopping their heads on nude bodies and creating child pornography. He's in a federal prison somewhere now, but that was a real case we had. Again, one of those guys that everybody loved, but maybe was a little too ingratiating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Seisha, just being aware of time, is there one last question that we could get to, or does that cover, or?
Just the last question is this session being recorded, and where can I find it for later viewing and sharing?
Yes, the session is being recorded, and we will make it available. If you're on here, you were registered, which means we have your registration email, which means the recording will be available to you. We're also looking into, because we've always done this in the past, getting it put on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel, Act United YouTube, has previous conference sessions on there as well that tackle many different topics as it relates to child sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. So it's a good place to go to for some other training as well. We've actually had our videos used in different professional training for nurses and at the Mayo. So please check us out there. And yes, we will get this link to everybody that's registered to share. So with that, I want to say a couple closing remarks, and I appreciate your time, everybody that stayed with us as we went over a little bit today. Very important topic, so much more to say, but please consider scheduling something, some further training for your staff or your organization or your church. But as we close our whole conference with our very last webinar this morning, we hope that this gave you very important information, as well as the action steps that you can take to join us in protecting the children and teens of our communities and our faith communities. For any questions that didn't get answered or that you think of later, or to learn more about our available programs, please reach out to us through the website. We have a contact form, or you can email us at connect.actunited@gmail.com. And I know that link or address has been going out during our session too. You should be receiving a survey by email following this webinar. Please fill it out because it helps us to help you better. It's 7 questions with an estimated time of 4 minutes, so we really appreciate it. Thank you to our speaker, elected Pine County Attorney Reese Frederickson. Thank you to our moderator, Seisha Boyk. And thank you to our sponsors today, Running for Justice of Elk River, Minnesota, to Dawn Peterson, Realtor with eXp Realty in Farmington, Minnesota. And thank you to everyone who joined us this morning. Please stay connected with us for more information, opportunities, events, safety tips, and join our conversation on our YouTube channel, Act United. We're also on Facebook as well as on Instagram at Act United MN. So with that, I thank everybody that's joined us this morning. Have a great day. Thank you.